The sun cast long shadows across the hallways of Westlake Middle School, as 12-year-old Maylene walked with her shoulders slightly hunched, trying to make herself invisible. It had been exactly 2 weeks since her family moved to this small town, after her father's company transferred him. 2 weeks of being the new girl, 2 weeks of eating lunch alone. Maylene tucked a strand of straight black hair behind her ear and clutched her notebooks tighter against her chest. Back in her old city school, being Chinese-American hadn't made her stand out. Here she was the only Asian student in the entire building, and she felt the weight of curious stares following her everywhere. Just give it time, her mother had said that morning, adjusting Maylene's collar before school. New places are always hard at first, but time seemed to crawl here. The classroom clocks ticked so slowly that Maylene sometimes wondered if they were broken. Today had been particularly rough. In math class, she'd known the answer to a difficult problem, but when she raised her hand and spoke, a boy in the back row had mimicked her slight accent. The teacher hadn't noticed, but the snickers that followed burned Maylene's cheeks with shame. When the lunch bell rang, she didn't head to the cafeteria. She couldn't face another meal pretending to be deeply interested in her sandwich, while conversations buzzed around her like insects she couldn't catch. Instead, she wandered down the quiet corridor toward the east wing of the school. She'd heard other students talking about the music department there. Apparently, Westlake had a prestigious program that had won state competitions for 3 years running. Music had always been Maylene's secret comfort. Her grandmother in China had hummed beautiful melodies while cooking, and sometimes at night, Maylene would put on headphones and lose herself in classical pieces that made her feel less alone. The corridor opened into a larger hallway lined with practice rooms. Through small windows in each door, Maylene could see instruments of all kinds, violins resting in open cases, cellos propped carefully against walls, brass instruments gleaming under fluorescent lights. At the end of the hall stood a set of double doors. One had been left slightly ajar, and soft afternoon light spilled through the opening. Maylene glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then slipped inside. The room took her breath away. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating a space 3 times the size of a normal classroom. Rows of chairs and music stands filled one half, while the other contained percussion instruments and a beautiful grand piano on a slightly raised platform. Maylene had never seen such a piano up close. In her apartment building back home, an elderly neighbor had owned an upright that she sometimes allowed Maylene to touch, showing her how to play simple tunes by ear. But this was something from another world. The piano's polished black surface reflected the sunlight like water. Without realizing she was moving, Maylene found herself walking toward it, drawn by some invisible force she couldn't name. "Hello?" she called softly, making sure the room was empty. Only silence answered her. Heart pounding, she approached the magnificent instrument. A small voice in her head warned that she probably shouldn't be here, that students like her weren't allowed to touch something so valuable. But another voice, stronger and more insistent, urged her forward. Maylene set her notebooks on a nearby chair and stood before the piano. Carefully, reverently, she lifted the fallboard that covered the keys, revealing a perfect row of black and white that seemed to stretch forever. Her finger hovered over middle C. She remembered that much from her neighbor's lessons. Taking a deep breath, she pressed down. The note rang out, pure and true, in the empty room. The sound was so much richer, so much more alive than she remembered from the old upright piano. This note had depth, had layers, had a soul. Emboldened, Maylene played another note, then another. She found the simple melody her neighbor had taught her, heart and soul, and began to pick it out with her right hand. Lost in concentration, she didn't hear the door open behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" Maylene jumped, her hands flying from the keys as if they'd suddenly turned hot. She spun around to find herself facing a tall girl with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expression of total disbelief. I'm sorry," Maylene stammered. "I didn't think anyone was here." The girl walked toward her, flanked by 2 friends who looked equally surprised to find someone at their piano. "This isn't a public playground," the blonde girl said. "This is the performance piano for advanced students." Her gaze swept over Maylene's simple jeans and t-shirt. "Are you even in the music program?" "No," Maylene admitted, her voice barely audible. "I just moved here," one of the other girls smirked. You can't just walk in and touch instruments you don't know how to play. That piano is worth more than your house, probably. Mei Lin felt her face burning again. She reached for her notebooks, wanting nothing more than to disappear. Wait, the blonde girl said, her eyes narrowing with sudden interest. Were you actually playing something just now? Just a simple song, Mei Lin said, looking at the floor. Nothing real. The three exchanged glances, and Mei Lin recognized that look. She'd seen it often enough since arriving. It was the look that said, "Can you believe this, girl?" "Let's hear it then," the blonde girl said, crossing her arms. "Show us what you can do." Mei Lin knew she was being mocked. She knew the proper response was to make an excuse and leave quickly, but something deep inside her, the same something that had drawn her to the piano in the first place, made her turn back toward the keys. "I only know a little bit," she said quietly. With trembling fingers, she began to play Heart and Soul again, this time adding the simple left-hand pattern her neighbor had shown her. The melody filled the room, childlike but clear. When she finished, she looked up to find all three girls staring at her with expressions that ranged from amusement to disbelief. "That's it?" asked the blonde girl. "That's baby stuff. We learned that before kindergarten." Her friends laughed, and Mei Lin wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. "Alyssa, Bethany, there you are," a woman's voice cut through the laughter. Mei Lin turned to see an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair striding into the room, carrying a stack of sheet music. "We have sectionals in 5 minutes," the woman said. Then she noticed Mei Lin. "Oh, hello there. I don't believe we've met." "This is the new girl, Ms. Reynolds," Alyssa, the blonde, explained with exaggerated patience. "We caught her playing with the Steinway." Ms. Reynolds raised an eyebrow and looked at Mei Lin with new interest. "Were you now? And what were you playing?" Before Mei Lin could answer, one of the other girls cut in. "Just Heart and Soul, baby stuff." Ms. Reynolds set down her music and approached Mei Lin. "What's your name, dear?" "Mei Lin Chen," she replied, clutching her notebooks tighter. "Have you had piano lessons before, Mei Lin?" She shook her head. "No, ma'am. Our neighbor showed me a few songs, but we didn't have room for a piano in our apartment." Alyssa didn't bother hiding her smirk. Mei Lin could practically hear her thoughts. This girl thinks she can just walk in and play without even having a piano. But Ms. Reynolds' expression remained thoughtful. "Would you play for me what you just played for the girls?" Feeling like she was walking to her own execution, Mei Lin sat down again at the piano bench. The beautiful notes of even the simple melody seemed to mock her now, highlighting how little she actually knew. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You have a good ear," Ms. Reynolds said finally. "You played that perfectly in tune, and your rhythm was quite steady for someone without training." Mei Lin looked up, surprised by the kindness in the teacher's voice. "We have a beginning piano class that meets during 6th period." Ms. Reynolds continued. "There's still room if you'd like to join us." "But Ms. Reynolds," Alyssa protested, "that class is for 7th graders. And everyone else started in September." "Then Mei Lin will have some catching up to do," the teacher replied calmly. "But that's not impossible, is it?" Mei Lin could hardly believe what she was hearing. An actual piano class? With a real teacher? "I'd love to," she said, her voice stronger now. "I mean, if it's really okay." "It's settled then." Ms. Reynolds smiled. "See the counselor about changing your schedule, and I'll see you in class tomorrow." As Mei Lin gathered her things to leave, she caught Alyssa whispering to her friends. "She'll never catch up. She doesn't even have a piano to practice on." The word stung, but Mei Lin held her head higher as she walked out. For the first time since moving to this town, she had something to look forward to. She had no idea how she would practice without a piano at home. She had no idea how she would catch up to students who'd been playing for months or years. But as she walked down the hallway, she could still feel the keys under her fingers, still hear that perfect middle C ringing in her mind. And for the first time in 2 weeks, she felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her place in this strange new world after all. What none of them knew, not Ms. Reynolds, not the snickering girls, not even Mei Lin herself, was that the moment her fingers had touched those piano keys, something extraordinary had awakened inside her. The next day, Mei Lin arrived at the music room 10 minutes early, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She stood in the doorway, watching as students unpacked their bags and settled at keyboards arranged in neat rows. Each student had their own digital piano with headphones, a far cry from the grand Steinway she had touched yesterday. "Come in, Maylin," Ms. Reynolds called, waving her forward. "We've got a spot for you right here." All eyes turned to her as she walked to the empty keyboard in the front row. Someone whispered behind her, followed by muffled laughter. Maylin kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, pretending not to notice. "Class, this is Maylin Chen. She's joining us a bit late in the semester, but I'm sure you'll all help her catch up," Ms. Reynolds said. Then turning to Maylin, she added, "We're currently working on reading treble clef notes and basic rhythms. Have you ever read music before?" Maylin shook her head. The symbols in the book Ms. Reynolds placed before her looked like a foreign language. Lines and dots and strange markings that made no sense at all. "That's perfectly fine," Ms. Reynolds said with an encouraging smile. "Everyone starts somewhere." From the back of the room came another whisper. "Yeah, but most people start when they're 5. Ms. Reynolds either didn't hear or chose to ignore it. "Let's begin with our warm-ups, everyone. Page 32, please." For the next 45 minutes, Maylin struggled to keep up. While other students played simple melodies with both hands, she laboriously picked out single notes, constantly checking the book to remember which key was which. Her fingers felt clumsy and slow. The headphones were both a blessing and a curse. They kept others from hearing her mistakes, but they also made her feel even more isolated. When the bell rang, Maylin's head was spinning with new information. Lines and spaces, quarter notes and half notes, treble clefs and bass clefs. It was overwhelming. "Don't worry," Ms. Reynolds told her as the other students filed out. "I've left a keyboard unlocked in practice room 3. You can use it during lunch or after school to catch up." Maylin nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. You have a good ear," the teacher added. "That will help. But there's no shortcut to reading music. It takes practice, practice." The word echoed in Maylin's mind as she walked to her next class. How was she supposed to practice properly without a piano at home? Her family lived in a small apartment, and her parents were already working overtime to afford the move. There was no way they could buy even the cheapest keyboard right now. During lunch, instead of going to the cafeteria, Maylin slipped into practice room 3. The small space contained nothing but a digital keyboard and a chair. She pulled out the beginner's book Ms. Reynolds had given her and started working through the first exercises, determined to catch up. She was so focused that she didn't notice the door opening. A throat cleared and she looked up to see Alyssa and her friends standing there, elegant in their matching Westlake Music Department hoodies. "Well, look who's trying to be Mozart," Alyssa said, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm just practicing," Maylin said quietly, her fingers still resting on the keys. One of the other girls, Bethany, Maylin thought her name was, stepped forward. "You know, most of us have been playing since we were little kids. I started when I was 4. I was 3, Alyssa added. My parents got me a baby grand for my 5th birthday." Maylin didn't know what to say to that. She couldn't even imagine having a piano at home, let alone getting one as a birthday present. "You should hear Alyssa play," the third girl said. "She's the best pianist in the school. She's playing Chopin for the winter concert." Alyssa smiled, clearly pleased by the praise. "Ms. Reynolds is just being nice letting you join the class. But don't get your hopes up about catching up. Piano isn't something you can just pick up overnight." "I know," Maylin said. "I'm not trying to—" "Anyway," Alyssa cut her off, "we actually need this practice room. We have chamber group rehearsal and Bethany left her music in here earlier." It was obviously a lie. But Maylin gathered her things without argument. As she squeezed past them to leave, Alyssa called after her. "By the way, the winter concert is in 8 weeks. All piano students have to perform. Good luck with that." The door closed behind her and Maylin stood in the hallway, clutching her books to her chest. A performance? In front of people? The thought made her stomach knot with anxiety. She could barely find middle C without looking at her hands. For the rest of the day, doubt gnawed at her. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe some talents really did require an early start, years of lessons and a piano at home. That evening, Maylin sat at the kitchen table, attempting to do her music theory homework. She had drawn a paper keyboard on cardboard and was practicing fingering positions, pressing silently on the fake keys. Her father walked in, still wearing his work uniform from the electronics factory where he'd found a job after the move. "What are you doing, little sparrow?" he asked, using his pet name for her. "Learning piano," Maylin said, then explained about the music class. Her father listened, his tired face brightening as she spoke. Music had always been important in their family. Before the Cultural Revolution, her father's parents had been musicians. Her grandmother played the guzheng, a traditional Chinese string instrument, and her grandfather had studied Western classical piano until such pursuits were banned. "Your grandfather would be so proud," he said, sitting beside her. "He always said music was the universal language." "But Baba, I don't have a real piano to practice on," Mei Lin said, gesturing at her cardboard keyboard. "The other kids have been playing since they were little. I'll never catch up." Her father thought for a moment. "Let me speak with your mother. Perhaps we can find a solution." 2 days later, Mei Lin came home from school to find a surprise waiting in their small living room, an electronic keyboard. Not a fancy one, certainly not new, but a real keyboard with weighted keys and a sustain pedal. Mrs. Zhang from the restaurant was selling it, her mother explained as Mei Lin stared in disbelief. "Her son went to college and doesn't play anymore. We can't afford new right now," her father added. But Mrs. Zhang gave us a good price. Tears sprang to Mei Lin's eyes as she hugged her parents. She knew what this meant. They had dipped into their savings, money they were setting aside for emergencies in this new and uncertain place. "I'll practice every day," she promised. "I won't waste this." And she didn't. Every morning, Mei Lin woke up an hour early to practice before school. Every evening, she practiced until her parents gently reminded her about bedtime. She carried her music book everywhere, studying notation during lunch and between classes. Ms. Reynolds noticed her dedication. "You're making remarkable progress," she told Mei Lin after 2 weeks of intense practice. "Your fingers are developing strength much faster than I expected." But not everyone was impressed. As Mei Lin improved, Alyssa and her friends seemed to find her presence even more irritating. They rolled their eyes when she volunteered answers in class. They whispered when she played her exercises. Once, someone even accidentally knocked her music off the stand during practice. The worst moment came 3 weeks into Mei Lin's piano journey. Ms. Reynolds had asked everyone to play their concert pieces for the class. Most students had been working on their selections since the beginning of the semester, polishing and perfecting every note. Mei Lin had been assigned a simple arrangement of Ode to Joy, the most basic piece on the concert program. Even this was challenging for her 3-week-old skills, but she had practiced relentlessly. When her turn came, she sat at the classroom's upright piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. She made it through the first line perfectly, her confidence growing with each correct note. Then in the second line, her fingers slipped, hitting a jarring wrong note. She paused, reset her hands, and continued. 2 more mistakes followed before she finished the piece. Her face burned with shame as she returned to her seat. "That was a good effort, Mei Lin," Ms. Reynolds said kindly. "Keep practicing those tricky measures." Then it was Alyssa's turn. She walked to the piano with perfect posture, arranged her sheet music, and adjusted the bench with practiced precision. Without hesitation, her fingers flew into Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, creating cascades of notes that filled the room with haunting beauty. Mei Lin watched in awe. How could human hands move that fast, that precisely? How could anyone remember so many notes? The piece was so complex that Mei Lin couldn't even follow the melody, let alone imagine playing it. When Alyssa finished, the class erupted in applause. She returned to her seat with a satisfied smile, pausing by Mei Lin's desk. "See the difference?" she whispered. "That's what real talent sounds like." The words stung, but they also ignited something in Mei Lin. Not just determination, but curiosity. That night, she searched online for Chopin Nocturne E-flat major and found dozens of recordings. She listened to one version after another, marveling at the piece's intricate beauty. On a whim, she sat at her keyboard and tried to pick out the opening melody by ear. To her surprise, she found it. Those first few haunting notes. She couldn't play it properly, couldn't manage the complex left-hand accompaniment or the delicate ornaments, but she could hear it in her mind with perfect clarity. For the first time, Mei Lin understood what her teacher meant about having a good ear. She might not be able to read music fluently yet, but she could hear patterns, remember melodies, and find them on the keyboard with unexpected ease. The realization gave her a new sense of purpose. Yes, she was far behind the others in technique and reading. Yes, the winter concert terrified her, but perhaps she had something valuable after all. something that couldn't be taught or bought with expensive lessons and baby grand pianos. As she practiced her simple ode to joy that night, a new thought took root in her mind. What if her late start wasn't a disadvantage, but simply a different path to the same destination? What if there was more than one way to speak the universal language of music? 5 weeks into her piano journey, Mei-Lin developed a routine. Every morning she practiced scales and finger exercises. Every afternoon she worked on Ode to Joy for the winter concert. And every evening after finishing her homework, she allowed herself one special treat: listening to recordings of beautiful piano pieces, trying to play small fragments by ear. It was during one of these evening sessions that Mei-Lin's mother paused in the doorway of their living room, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. "That doesn't sound like your concert piece," she said, listening to Mei-Lin pick out a delicate melody. "It's not," Mei-Lin admitted. "It's part of the Chopin piece Alyssa is playing. I'm just playing around with it." Her mother set down the laundry basket and came closer. "Play it again." Mei-Lin replayed the opening measures of the nocturne slower than they should be, with none of the left-hand accompaniment, but the melody was unmistakable. "How did you learn this?" her mother asked. "Did Ms. Reynolds give you the music?" "No, I just listened to it and figured it out," Mei-Lin said with a small shrug. "I can hear where the notes should go." Her mother's expression changed to something Mei-Lin couldn't quite read, surprise mixed with something else. "Pride perhaps, or worry. Your grandfather could do that," she said quietly. "Your father told me stories. He could hear a folk song once at a festival and come home and play it perfectly." Mei-Lin hadn't known this about her grandfather, who had died before she was born. The thought of this connection across time, this shared ability, gave her a warm feeling. "Is that good?" she asked. Her mother smiled. "It's special. But Mei-Lin, you must still focus on your assigned piece for the concert." "This Chopin is too advanced," Mei-Lin nodded. She knew her mother was right. Playing fragments of advanced pieces was fun, but she still struggled with the basics. Her fingers remained clumsy on many techniques, and her music reading was painfully slow. The next day, Mei-Lin arrived early to use the practice room before school. To her surprise, Ms. Reynolds was already in the music department, sorting through sheet music in her office. "Good morning, Mei-Lin," the teacher called. "You're here bright and early." "I wanted to practice before class," Mei-Lin explained. Ms. Reynolds gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Come sit for a moment. I'd like to talk with you." Mei-Lin's stomach tightened with anxiety. Was she being removed from the class? Had she made too many mistakes? "You've been working very hard," Ms. Reynolds began, "and I've noticed something interesting. When you sight read, that means playing music you're seeing for the first time. You struggle quite a bit." Mei-Lin nodded miserably. "But," Ms. Reynolds continued, "when you play something you've heard before, even without seeing the music, your playing has a different quality, more natural, more musical." "I just find it easier to play what I can hear in my head," Mei-Lin admitted. "That's called playing by ear, and it's quite a gift," Ms. Reynolds said. "Some of the greatest musicians in history had that ability. Mozart, for instance, could hear a piece once and reproduce it entirely." Mei-Lin's eyes widened. "Really? Really? Now, I'm not saying you should stop learning to read music. That's an essential skill. But I think we can work with your natural abilities instead of fighting against them." Ms. Reynolds shuffled through some papers on her desk. "What if we try a different approach for your concert piece?" "A different approach?" Mei-Lin repeated, confused. "Yes, I'm going to play Ode to Joy for you, the complete arrangement with both hands, exactly as it should sound at the concert. I want you to close your eyes and just listen. Don't look at the sheet music, don't worry about finger positions. Just listen." Ms. Reynolds led Mei-Lin to the Steinway and played the simple but beautiful arrangement. The melody sang out clear and strong, supported by rich harmonies in the left hand. When she finished, she turned to Mei-Lin. "Now, I want you to try playing what you just heard. Don't worry about being perfect. Just see what you remember." Nervously, Mei-Lin sat at the piano. She closed her eyes for a moment, hearing the piece again in her mind. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The melody came easily. She'd been practicing it for weeks. But now, tentatively, she added fragments of the left-hand part Ms. Reynolds had played, simple chords and bass notes that supported the melody. She made several mistakes, her left hand uncertain of its role, but the essence of the full arrangement was there. When she finished, Ms. Reynolds was staring at her with an odd expression. "Mei-Lin, You just played parts of the accompaniment I didn't teach you, that weren't in your simplified version. You heard it once and reproduced it. Not very well, Maylin said, embarrassed by her mistakes, but remarkably well for someone who's only been playing for 5 weeks. Ms. Reynolds tapped her fingers thoughtfully against the piano. I'd like to try something. Would you be willing to stay after school today for a little while? That afternoon, Maylin returned to the music room as requested. To her surprise, Ms. Reynolds had set up a recording device next to the Steinway. I want to conduct a little experiment, if that's okay with you, the teacher explained. I'm going to play a simple piece you've never heard before. I'd like you to listen carefully, then try to play as much of it as you can remember. I'll record your attempt so we can listen to it together. Maylin nodded, though her heart was beating fast. What if she failed completely? What if she couldn't remember anything? Ms. Reynolds played a cheerful, bouncy piece that Maylin didn't recognize. It wasn't technically difficult, but it had several distinct sections and a catchy rhythm. When Ms. Reynolds finished, she gestured for Maylin to take her place at the piano. Just do your best. It doesn't have to be perfect. Maylin closed her eyes, trying to hold the music in her memory. Then she began to play. The opening came easily, a repeating pattern that established the rhythm of the piece. The middle section was hazier in her mind, and her fingers hesitated, finding some notes but missing others. But then the final section cleared in her memory, and she finished with growing confidence. When she opened her eyes, Ms. Reynolds was smiling broadly. That was Bach's Minuet in G, she said. You just played about 70% of it correctly after hearing it once. Do you know how extraordinary that is? Maylin shook her head, not sure what to make of this information. Many trained musicians can't do what you just did, Ms. Reynolds explained. You have a rare gift called auditory musical memory, the ability to remember and reproduce music you've heard. Combined with your natural sense of pitch, it's a powerful talent. But I still can't read music very well, Maylin said, and my technique is still so basic. Reading and technique can be taught, Ms. Reynolds said firmly. What you have is much harder to develop. It's innate. She pressed the playback button on the recorder, and Maylin heard her own halting but recognizable version of the Bach piece. I'd like to work with you individually, Ms. Reynolds continued. Twice a week after school. We'll still focus on reading and technique, but we'll also nurture this special ability of yours. Would that be all right? Maylin could hardly believe what she was hearing. Special lessons? A special ability? Just 5 weeks ago, she'd been the girl who knew nothing, who didn't belong. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than usual. I'd like that very much. The next few weeks passed in a blur of practice and discovery. True to her word, Ms. Reynolds began working with Maylin after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The sessions were challenging but exhilarating. Ms. Reynolds would play pieces just slightly beyond Maylin's technical ability, then guide her through reproducing them by ear, adding proper technique along the way. Music is a language, Ms. Reynolds often said. Some people learn languages by studying grammar rules and vocabulary lists. Others learn by listening and speaking. You're the second type of learner when it comes to music. With this new approach, Maylin's progress accelerated dramatically. Her fingers grew stronger and more precise. Her ear became even more sensitive to subtle differences in tone and rhythm. And while her sight reading remained slower than her classmates, her ability to learn pieces by hearing them once or twice amazed everyone who witnessed it. Everyone except Alyssa and her friends, who viewed Maylin's special lessons with suspicion and resentment. She's just the teacher's pet because she has a sob story, Alyssa said loudly one day as Maylin entered the classroom. Oh, poor her, she never had lessons before. Maylin pretended not to hear, taking her usual seat at the keyboard. The winter concert was now just 3 weeks away, and tension was building among all the students. Everyone was polishing their pieces, worrying about memory slips and technical challenges. Ms. Reynolds had upgraded Maylin's concert piece from the simplified Ode to Joy to the full arrangement, complete with harmonies and a more complex structure. It was still the easiest piece on the program, but it was a genuine challenge for someone who had been playing for only 2 months. During class that day, Ms. Reynolds announced a pre-concert recital. Next week, you'll all perform your pieces for each other, exactly as you would at the concert. This will help with performance nerves and give you a chance to receive feedback before the big day. A murmur of nervous excitement ran through the classroom. Maylin felt her palms grow sweaty at the thought of playing for her peers, especially Alyssa, who never missed a chance to point out Maylin's shortcomings. After class, Alyssa cornered Maylin in the hallway. "I heard you practicing yesterday," she said. "The real version of Ode to Joy, not the baby version. You think you're so special because you can copy what you hear." Maylin looked down at her shoes. "I'm just trying to learn like everyone else." "Like everyone else?" Alyssa laughed. "The rest of us spent years learning properly. You're just taking shortcuts. That's not real musicianship." As Alyssa walked away, Maylin felt a flicker of doubt. Was her ability to play by ear really just a shortcut? Was she somehow cheating by learning this way? That evening, she asked her father about it while they washed dishes after dinner. "Baba, is it wrong to learn piano by ear instead of just reading music?" Her father considered the question as he dried a plate. "Who says it's wrong?" Maylin explained what Alyssa had said about shortcuts and real musicianship. Her father set down the dish towel. "Let me tell you something about your grandfather. During the Cultural Revolution, Western music was forbidden. Your grandfather couldn't access sheet music for the pieces he loved, so he would listen to scratchy recordings over and over, memorizing every note. When it was safe, he would play these pieces from memory. Was that a shortcut? Or was it dedication and love for music that found a way despite obstacles?" Maylin thought about this, about her grandfather keeping music alive in dangerous times, note by memorized note. "Different paths can lead to the same destination," her father said gently. "Your way of learning isn't wrong, it's just your way. The music is what matters, not how you found it." That night, Maylin practiced with renewed purpose. As her fingers moved across the keys, playing not just the notes of Ode to Joy, but feeling the emotion behind them, she realized something important. Music wasn't about impressing Alyssa or anyone else. It wasn't about proving she belonged. Music was about connection. To the composer who wrote the notes hundreds of years ago, to the listeners who would hear her play, to her grandfather who had kept melodies alive through difficult times, to something larger than herself that couldn't be contained in sheet music or technical exercises. For the first time since she'd started playing, Maylin stopped worrying about catching up. Instead, she focused on something more important, finding her own voice in this universal language she was just beginning to speak. The day of the pre-concert recital arrived with a flutter of nervous energy in the music department. Students paced the hallways, muttering passages under their breath or flexing their fingers in silent rehearsal. Maylin sat quietly in a corner, eyes closed, hearing Ode to Joy play in her mind from beginning to end. Ms. Reynolds had arranged the classroom to resemble a performance space. The upright piano stood at the front, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Chairs were arranged in rows for the audience. On a small table near the door, someone had even set up a pitcher of water and paper cups for the performers. "Just like a real concert," Ms. Reynolds announced as the students filed in. "You'll come up when I call your name, bow before and after your performance, and play your piece completely from memory. Consider this a dress rehearsal." Maylin's stomach tightened. From memory? She had been practicing with the sheet music as a safety net, though she rarely looked at it anymore. The thought of performing without it made her palms sweat. "We'll go in reverse program order," Ms. Reynolds continued, consulting her list. "Which means, Maylin, you're first." A ripple of whispers ran through the room. Going first was both a blessing and a curse. No waiting, but no chance to see how others handled their nerves. Maylin walked to the piano on shaky legs. The short distance from her seat to the instrument felt like miles. She could feel everyone watching her, especially Alyssa and her friends who sat with arms crossed, expressions skeptical. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands in her lap. Her mind went terrifyingly blank for a moment. What was she supposed to play again? "Take your time," Ms. Reynolds said gently. "When you're ready." Maylin closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and suddenly the music was there again, waiting in her mind. She lifted her hands to the keys and began to play. The first notes came easily, the familiar melody of Ode to Joy flowing from her fingers. But as she moved into the second section, where the left hand had more complex harmonies, doubt crept in. Was that an F or an F sharp? Should the chord change here or later? Her hesitation led to a wrong note, then another. The beautiful flow of the piece stuttered and nearly stopped. Panic rose in her chest, and then, in the moment of greatest confusion, she heard her father's voice in her memory. "The music is what matters, not how you found it. Maylin stopped trying to remember the exact notes on the page. Instead, she listened to the music in her head, letting her ear guide her fingers. The melody returned, stronger now, supported by harmonies that might not have been exactly what Beethoven wrote, but that carried the spirit of the piece. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the polite applause began. Ms. Reynolds was smiling, but Maylin could see the concern in her eyes. "Thank you. Maylin, that was creative. We'll talk about it after class." The rest of the recital passed in a blur. Student after student performed their pieces: Bach minuets, Clementi sonatinas, Chopin waltzes. Some played perfectly but mechanically. Others made technical mistakes but brought emotion to their playing. Finally, Alyssa took her place at the piano for the grand finale. Her posture was perfect, her expression serene. Without a moment's hesitation, she launched into Chopin's Nocturne. It was beautiful, Maylin had to admit. Every note was exactly right, every dynamic shift executed with precision. Alyssa's fingers seemed to dance across the keys, creating cascades of sound that filled the room. When she finished, the applause was enthusiastic. Ms. Reynolds beamed with pride. "Excellent work, Alyssa. That will be a highlight of the concert." After class, Maylin stayed behind as requested. She expected criticism for her memory lapses, for the wrong notes, for the improvisations she'd added when she couldn't remember the original. "You changed the piece," Ms. Reynolds said once they were alone. Maylin nodded miserably. "I'm sorry. I couldn't remember some parts exactly, so I just played what sounded right to me." To her surprise, Ms. Reynolds didn't look angry. "What you did was actually quite advanced. You essentially improvised around the main theme, keeping the spirit of the piece intact. Most beginners couldn't do that." "But it wasn't right," Maylin protested. "It wasn't what Beethoven wrote." "No," Ms. Reynolds agreed. "It wasn't. And in classical music, particularly in a student recital, we generally aim to play what the composer intended." She paused thoughtfully. "However, your instincts were musical, even if your execution was imperfect. Your changes made sense harmonically." Maylin wasn't sure if this was praise or criticism. "I have a suggestion," Ms. Reynolds continued. "For the concert, let's have you play the piece as written. But afterward, maybe we can explore this improvisational talent of yours. It's actually quite valuable in many musical contexts. Jazz, composition, accompaniment. You're not disappointed in me?" Maylin asked hesitantly. Ms. Reynolds laughed. "Quite the opposite. I'm increasingly fascinated by your musical mind. It doesn't work like most of my students, but that's not a bad thing." She patted Maylin's shoulder. "Now let's work on securing that memory before the real concert." For the next week, Maylin practiced with renewed focus. She made sure she could play Ode to Joy exactly as written, note for note, with no improvisations or alterations. Her parents listened to her practice each evening, offering encouragement and support. "You'll be wonderful," her mother assured her. "We're so proud of how hard you've worked." The night before the concert, Maylin couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, playing the piece in her mind over and over, checking for spots where she might forget or falter. Around midnight, she crept out of bed and sat at her keyboard with headphones, playing one last time to reassure herself. As she played in the darkness of their small living room, Maylin realized something had changed in these past 8 weeks. The keyboard keys no longer felt foreign under her fingers. The patterns of music no longer seemed mysterious. Somehow, without her noticing the exact moment it happened, she had become a pianist. Not an accomplished one, certainly not a professional one, but a real one nonetheless. The realization brought a sense of peace that finally allowed her to sleep. The day of the winter concert dawned clear and cold. Snow had fallen overnight, dusting the school grounds with white. Maylin arrived early, as Ms. Reynolds had instructed all performers to do. The auditorium was much larger than the classroom, with rows of seats stretching back into shadows. A full-sized grand piano gleamed under the stage lights. The sight of it made Maylin's heart race. She had only played the Steinway in the music room a few times. This piano was bigger, grander, more intimidating. "We'll have a brief rehearsal on the concert piano," Ms. Reynolds announced to the gathered students. "Each of you will play a small section of your piece to get comfortable with the instrument." When Maylin's turn came, she approached the piano cautiously. The bench felt higher, the keys slightly wider than what she was used to. She played the opening phrase of Ode to Joy, and the rich sound that emerged surprised her. Even her simple playing sounded better on this magnificent instrument. Backstage, as the concert time approached, the atmosphere grew tense with nervous excitement. Students in formal black and white concert attire paced and fidgeted. Maylene wore a simple black skirt and white blouse her mother had purchased specially for the occasion. Not as fancy as some of the others' outfits, but neat and appropriate. Alyssa and her friends huddled together, looking elegant and composed. Occasionally they glanced in Maylene's direction, but she pretended not to notice. Today wasn't about them. It was about her and the music. Ms. Reynolds gathered everyone for final instructions. Remember, you've all prepared thoroughly. Trust your practice. If you make a mistake, keep going. Most listeners won't even notice. And most importantly, try to enjoy this moment. Making music is a gift you're sharing with the audience. From the stage, they could hear the murmur of voices as parents and friends found their seats in the auditorium. Maylene peeked through the curtain and spotted her parents in the third row. Her father had left work early to be there. They both looked so proud already, before she'd played a single note. The concert began with the youngest students, elementary school beginners playing simple pieces with careful concentration. Then came the intermediate players, including most of Maylene's classmates. The music grew more complex with each performer. Maylene was scheduled just before Alyssa, who would close the show with her Chopin. As she waited in the wings, listening to the performer before her, Maylene felt strangely calm. The panic she had expected didn't materialize. Instead, a focused readiness took its place. Next, the announcer said, "We have Maylene Chen performing Beethoven's Ode to Joy." Maylene walked onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she expected, making it difficult to see the audience clearly. She found the piano bench, sat down, and adjusted her position. The keys gleamed before her, waiting. For a moment, she sat perfectly still, gathering herself. She thought of her grandfather, who had kept music alive through difficult times. She thought of her parents, who had sacrificed to support her unexpected passion. She thought of Ms. Reynolds, who had recognized something in her worth nurturing. Then Maylene placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The piece was simple, far simpler than what most of the other students were performing. But from the first notes, Maylene played with a clarity and warmth that filled the auditorium. The familiar melody sang out, joyful and bright. Her fingers found each note with certainty, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. In that moment, the weeks of struggle, the mockery, the doubts, all fell away. There was only Maylene and the piano and Beethoven's timeless celebration of joy. She wasn't playing from memory or from the sheet music or even by ear. She was playing from her heart. When the final chord faded, there was a brief silence before the applause began. Maylene stood, bowed as she had been taught, and walked off the stage. In the wings, Ms. Reynolds was waiting with a broad smile. "That was beautiful, Maylene, absolutely beautiful. I didn't make any mistakes," Maylene said, slightly amazed at this fact. "It wasn't just the lack of mistakes," Ms. Reynolds said. "It was the musicality. You made that simple piece sing." Before Maylene could respond, the announcer called Alyssa's name. She swept past them in her elegant black dress, head high, ready for her moment in the spotlight. "You should watch this," Ms. Reynolds whispered to Maylene. "You can learn a lot from Alyssa's technique." Together, they stood in the wings as Alyssa seated herself at the piano. Her performance of the nocturne was flawless, her fingers flying across the keys with remarkable precision. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and Alyssa took 3 graceful bows before exiting the stage. As she passed Maylene in the wings, their eyes met briefly. There was no mockery in Alyssa's expression now, perhaps just a hint of surprise. Maylene smiled slightly. They would never be friends, probably, but maybe they could be fellow pianists, each with her own gifts. After the concert, Maylene's parents enveloped her in a group hug. "You were wonderful," her mother said, eyes shining with unshed tears. Her father simply held her tight for a long moment. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," he whispered. The day after the winter concert, something subtle but unmistakable changed in the way people looked at Maylene. Students who had never spoken to her before nodded in the hallways. A few even congratulated her on her performance. "You played really well," said a boy from her math class. "I didn't know you were a pianist." "I'm just a beginner," Maylene replied, still unused to this kind of recognition. Didn't sound like a beginner to me, he said with a shrug. In piano class, the atmosphere had shifted too. Mei-Lin was no longer the obvious outsider. She belonged now, not because she was the most skilled or the most experienced, but because she had proven herself on stage, facing the same challenges as everyone else. Even Alyssa's friends seemed less hostile, though Alyssa herself maintained a cool distance. Still, there were no more whispered comments, no more rolled eyes when Mei-Lin played. Ms. Reynolds, however, was far from satisfied with this new status quo. When Mei-Lin arrived for her Thursday afternoon special session, she found the teacher bursting with a new idea. "I've been thinking about your musical development," Ms. Reynolds said without preamble. "You've made remarkable progress with the basics, but I believe it's time to challenge you in a different way." Mei-Lin waited nervously. What kind of challenge did Ms. Reynolds have in mind? "The Spring Music Festival is in April. That's 4 months from now," the teacher continued. "It's a bigger event than our winter concert, with participants from schools across the district. There's a special category for original compositions." "Original compositions?" Mei-Lin repeated. "You mean writing music?" "Exactly. I think you should compose a piece for the festival." Mei-Lin stared at her teacher in disbelief. "But I've only been playing for 2 months. I don't know how to write music." "You already do, in a way," Ms. Reynolds said. "Remember the pre-concert recital? When you forgot parts of Ode to Joy, you didn't stop, you improvised. Your instincts for harmony and musical structure guided you to create something new but appropriate." "That was just making things up because I was nervous," Mei-Lin protested. "Perhaps, but it revealed a creative musical mind." Ms. Reynolds sat down at the piano and played a simple C major chord. Music composition isn't some mystical process available only to geniuses. It's a craft that can be learned like any other, and your ear gives you a head start. Over the next hour, Ms. Reynolds introduced Mei-Lin to basic concepts of composition, how melodies are constructed, how harmonies support them, how musical phrases form sentences and paragraphs of sound. It was overwhelming but fascinating. "For now, just start listening more actively," Ms. Reynolds suggested as their session ended. "When you hear music, ask yourself, what makes this melody memorable? How does the composer create tension and resolution? Where do phrases begin and end? Your ear will teach you much of what you need to know." That night, Mei-Lin listened to music with new awareness. Songs she had heard 100 times revealed secrets she'd never noticed before. Patterns of notes that created expectation, harmonic shifts that surprised or comforted, rhythms that propelled the music forward or held it in contemplation. The next day, she tried creating a simple melody of her own. She recorded it on her phone, listened critically, then adjusted notes that didn't quite work. It was just a small musical phrase, nothing special, but it was hers, something that hadn't existed in the world until she created it. Over the following weeks, Mei-Lin divided her practice time between technical exercises, repertoire pieces, and composition experiments. She filled a notebook with musical ideas, some just a few measures long, others developing into extended melodies with accompaniment. January turned to February, and Mei-Lin's composition began to take shape. It was a piece influenced by both Western classical music and the Chinese folk songs her grandmother had sung, a bridge between the two worlds that made up her heritage. Ms. Reynolds provided guidance, but was careful not to impose her own ideas. "This is your voice," she reminded Mei-Lin. "I'm just helping you speak more clearly." One snowy afternoon in late February, Mei-Lin was working on her composition in practice room 3 when the door opened. She looked up, expecting Ms. Reynolds for their scheduled session. Instead, Alyssa stood in the doorway. "Sorry," Alyssa said stiffly. "I didn't know someone was in here." Mei-Lin quickly gathered her music sheets. "I'm done anyway. You can have the room." As she stood to leave, Alyssa didn't move from the doorway. She seemed to be struggling with something. "Was that original?" she finally asked, nodding toward the piano. "What you were playing just now?" Mei-Lin nodded cautiously. "It's for the spring festival. Ms. Reynolds suggested I enter the composition category." It sounded, Alyssa paused, searching for the right word. "Different. In a good way. Not like the usual student compositions." Coming from Alyssa, this was extraordinary praise. Mei-Lin felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks. I'm still working on the middle section. It doesn't flow right yet, Alyssa hesitated, then stepped fully into the room, letting the door close behind her. The transition from the minor section back to major? You could tell that's where I was having trouble? Maylin asked, surprised by Alyssa's perception. It's always the transitions that are hardest, Alyssa said with the authority of experience. My composition teacher says that's where most young composers get stuck. You compose too? Alyssa shrugged, trying to seem casual, though pride shone through her expression. Since I was 8. My piece won the district festival last year. There was an awkward silence as both girls realized they were having their first actual conversation. I could listen if you want, Alyssa offered hesitantly. Sometimes a fresh ear helps. It was the last thing Maylin had expected, but she nodded and sat back down at the piano. Taking a deep breath, she played her composition from the beginning, the gentle opening theme, its development into something more complex, and then the troublesome transition that kept eluding her. When she finished, Alyssa was looking thoughtful rather than critical. What if you delayed the resolution by 2 measures? Like this. She stepped forward, reached over Maylin's shoulder, and played a variation of the transition, similar to what Maylin had written, but with a subtle difference that somehow made everything work better. That's it, Maylin exclaimed. That's exactly what it needed. Alyssa stepped back, seeming almost embarrassed by Maylin's enthusiasm. It's a good piece, very personal. Unlike me, you've had composition lessons, Maylin said. I'm just figuring things out as I go. Something flickered in Alyssa's eyes. Not quite respect, perhaps, but acknowledgement. That's even more impressive then, she said quietly. After that day, a cautious, fragile bridge formed between them. They weren't friends exactly, but they shared something important, the language of music. Occasionally, Alyssa would offer a suggestion about Maylin's composition, and Maylin would listen appreciatively to Alyssa's latest repertoire pieces, genuinely admiring her technical prowess. As March arrived, bringing the first hints of spring, Maylin's composition was nearly complete. She had titled it, 2 Worlds, 1 Heart, a reflection of her journey between cultures, between being an outsider and finding belonging through music. Ms. Reynolds helped her notate the piece properly for submission to the festival committee. Your composition has been selected to be performed, she announced one afternoon, beaming with pride. You'll play it yourself at the festival. Maylin felt equal parts terror and excitement at the news. Performing her own music seemed even more personal, more vulnerable than playing Beethoven or Bach. What if people didn't understand what she was trying to express? What if they thought it was too simple or too strange? Ms. Reynolds, she asked hesitantly, do you think it's good enough compared to what others will perform? The teacher considered the question carefully. It's different. Not everyone will connect with it, but those who do will be deeply moved. She squeezed Maylin's shoulder. Art isn't about being good enough by some universal standard. It's about being true to your own voice. The day of the spring festival arrived with sunshine and birdsong. The event was held at the district's Performing Arts Center, a proper concert hall with professional acoustics and lighting. Students from a dozen schools filled the backstage area, instruments and sheet music in hand. Maylin's parents sat in the audience, joined by her grandmother, who had traveled from China for a visit, her first since Maylin was a small child. The elderly woman spoke little English, but when Maylin had played her composition for her the night before, tears had filled her eyes. Music speaks when words cannot, she had said in Mandarin, holding Maylin's hands in her weathered ones. The composition category came in the middle of the program. Maylin waited backstage, watching other young composers present their works. Some played by the composers themselves, others by small ensembles of student musicians. Alyssa's piece, a technically impressive showcase for piano, received enthusiastic applause. When it was Maylin's turn, she walked to the center of the stage where the grand piano waited. The hall was larger than she had imagined, the sea of faces both intimidating and exhilarating. Somewhere out there sat her family, Ms. Reynolds, classmates, strangers, all waiting to hear what she had created. Maylin took her seat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. She had no sheet music before her. Her composition lived in her heart and memory now. She began to play the opening theme, a simple melody inspired by a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child. The notes floated out over the hushed audience, clear and pure in the perfect acoustics of the hall. Then came the Western classical influences, harmonies that Bach or Chopin might have recognized, but supporting that distinctly Chinese melodic line. As she played, Mei Lin lost awareness of the audience, lost consciousness of her fingers on the keys. She was inside the music now, not performing it but living it. Every note was a word in the story she was telling, the story of a girl caught between worlds, finding her voice through an ancient language that needed no translation. The piece built to its climax. The two musical traditions no longer separate but interwoven, complementary, creating something new yet timeless. Then it resolved into a peaceful coda, like a question finally answered, a journey completed. When the final notes faded, Mei Lin opened her eyes, returning to the present moment. For one terrifying second, there was complete silence in the hall. Had they understood? Had her message reached them? Then came the applause. Not polite appreciation, but genuine enthusiastic response. People were standing, something they hadn't done for any previous performance. Mei Lin rose from the bench, dazed by the reaction, and bowed as she had been taught. As she straightened, she caught sight of her grandmother in the third row, eyes shining with tears but face radiant with pride. Beside her, Mei Lin's parents were applauding with everyone else, her father calling out "Bravo!" In his accented English. Backstage, Ms. Reynolds embraced her. "You did it. You truly did it." "Did what?" Mei Lin asked, still processing what had just happened. "You spoke your truth through music and people heard you." The teacher's eyes were suspiciously bright. "That's what music is all about. Connection, communication, bridging the gaps between us. Some students play for years and never achieve what you just did." Later, after the awards had been distributed, Mei Lin received an honorable mention, with Alyssa winning first place. A distinguished-looking man approached Mei Lin and her family in the lobby. "Ms. Chen, I'm Professor Lin from the Conservatory's youth program. Your piece today was quite remarkable." He handed her a business card. "We have a summer program for promising young composers. Full scholarships are available for exceptional students. I'd like to hear more of your work." Mei Lin stared at the card in her hand, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. The conservatory was the most prestigious music school in the state. Her mother spoke up, concern in her voice. "She's only been playing piano for 6 months. Surely your program requires more experience?" The professor looked surprised. 6 months? That's unusual." He studied Mei Lin with new interest. "But talent is talent, regardless of when it's discovered. And your daughter has something special. A unique voice." That night, as the family celebrated with a special dinner, Mei Lin's grandmother held her hand across the table. "Your music," she said in Mandarin, "it told our family's story. I heard my mother in it, and myself and you. 3 generations connected by melody." Mei Lin squeezed her grandmother's hand. Too moved to speak. Later, as her parents discussed the professor's offer, debating the practicalities of transportation to the conservatory and how to balance music with regular studies, Mei Lin slipped away to the living room where her keyboard waited. She sat down and played a few quiet notes, marveling at how much had changed in 6 short months. The keys that had once seemed so foreign were now friends, confidants, extensions of her thoughts and feelings. Mei Lin thought about the journey ahead. So much still to learn, so many challenges to face. The path of a musician was not an easy one. She understood that now. There would be setbacks and frustrations, moments of doubt and disappointment, but there would also be joy, the pure, transcendent joy of creation, of expression, of connecting with others through the universal language of music, a language that, against all odds, she had begun to make her own. As the last light of day faded outside her window, Mei Lin began to play a new melody, one that hadn't existed until this moment.